let's talk about our film because it's a film that after I watched it, it's a film that while I was watching it, I was like, okay, this is okay, it's good, but it was sitting with me a lot after I watched it, like it was growing on me, just because I'm such a film geek, and I love classics, and I love Citizen Kane, and just this story is great to know about how Citizen Kane came, like the whole inspiration for that movie came to be, and it really had a lot to do with Mankiewicz, more than Orson Welles, and of course, dude, I mean, the writer is the guy at the start of it all, you know, but I just didn't realize what kind of mind this man had. Like he was such a talent, but he was also like so full of himself, so like destructive in his ways too, to the people around him and to himself. So it was really, really interesting. And Gary Oldman is just quite a presence on screen. There's one line that he says in the movie that kind of sums up the whole theme, I think, and it's when he's always joking. Just he's got verbal diarrhea, man. He's constantly just saying whatever comes to mind, right? So he, but it's and his like this defense mechanism he has, probably because of his insecurities, is he just uses humor for everything. And he was joking when he said this, but it kind of does sum up a lot of what the film plays with. What kind of man, what kind of person you are, right? He says, socialism, you share the wealth, and communism, you share the poverty. And I thought that was such an interesting way of looking at it. Because this movie really becomes about Mank versus William Randolph Hearst. The, and William Randolph Hearst is the guy that Mankiewicz based Charles Kane on in Citizen Kane, and to see what was happening in reality during that time and how it inspired Mank to write the film was very interesting. Something that while you're watching it, maybe you're getting a little bored with it at first, but then after you finish the movie and that final climactic scene and everything, like you're thinking about it. I found myself thinking about it constantly. Everything about right off the bat with the writing too, with Jack Fincher. Here's a guy who is an old time screenwriter who's been dead. He died in 2003. But David Fincher, the director, took that script and made the movie that Jack had intended to make. This story about Mankiewicz, this autobiography about Mankiewicz that Jack Fincher wrote. David Fincher, the director, no relation. At least, I mean, I checked. I looked and looked and looked. I didn't see a relation. I don't think there's a relation. David Fincher took that movie that he wrote, made this movie. I'm sure there were some tweaks, maybe, but for the most part, I think it's what Fincher wrote. That was really interesting. That was like that would have been a cool fun fact for this movie, if this were the fun fact of the week or something. But it's not. It's the main topic. Topical. The film, and then everything about the film tried to actually honor what Jack Fincher, the era of Fincher, but also Jack Fincher, but also the era of Citizen Kane, the era of when Herman Mankiewicz was writing movies. Everything about it, dude. This movie was made to be like an old movie, and I loved it. The film is in black and white. There are even effects, filters, cuts, and fades that all give that old film reel look of the 40s, right? Even more than that, though, the sound mixing in particular was done this certain way to make it sound like 1940s films. And I loved that. The fades were the best. The fades to black to transition in between the scenes. It's so 40s. That's so old school. And we had those little like film reel like marks from the way that the reel would have been cut a certain way. Sometimes you get those little like blips. I loved that stuff. Those little effects were so important to making this style that Fincher was trying to express, like just kind of jump off the screen at us. This is an old movie that we're getting today. Isn't that fucking? I mean, it was just but also the contrast is effective. We have an old style film, but it's also a rated R film. It's like a modern film, but an old film at the same time. That contrast was interesting. Some of the things depicted on screen here are also very much things that back in the 40s you would not have been able to show or say. Like fuck. Like just saying fuck. Like that comes up in the and it feels like almost like you're breaking a law or something. You're watching this old movie and then they start cursing. It seems like you jumped into some kind of alternate reality for a minute. And I loved that whole thing. Stylistically, I loved the movie. Stylistically. Um, but also structurally, the choice of like screenplay structure being using it as a device, as a plot device. I love when filmmakers do that. I talked about it when Guy Ritchie did it in The Gentleman. Like he had like that whole he had an element of that to it. I loved that. And this too. The film is about a screenwriter, so having these transitions the way he did was so cool. It really was. He would have the screenplay slug lines to transition into the new scenes. It was like this awesome little meta quality, right? When you move on to any new scene when you're writing, you start with a slug line. It's a heading, like location, interior, exterior, and what time of day it is, right? And he actually visually put those onto the screen every time he was changing to a new scene. I loved it. It was to benefit the structure. It helped establish much easier what year we were in because there was a whole flashback take. We were in one time for half the movie and we were in another time for half the movie, intercutting back and forth. So every time it would come up on the screen, the heading, if it was back in the day, it would say in parentheses flashback right on the screen. It kind of benefited the film in that regard. You didn't actually have to tell. You didn't have to show us that we were in another time. He would literally tell us we were in another time. Something that actually is against. It's almost against the rules again to do that. Like if you did that in any other regular movie, like it'd be like, don't tell us, show us. And so I love when filmmakers play with those. They play with the rules too. I love that. It's very creative. Yeah, the stakes are clear enough. Mank, here's a guy called upon to write for the 24-year-old prodigy Orson Welles. So back then, RKO was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they needed some kind of like wild card solution, and they hired the young prodigy of that time, Orson Welles, and gave him full control over a project. They said, "You do everything. You have final cut. You have just hire who you want, work with who you just do whatever you want. Make your movie." Total anonymity. Total Fuck you, dude. Total autonomy. Is it autonomy? I'm gonna fucking look this up after and really beat myself up for it. Total autonomy over the project. I think that's the word. They gave him total control, everything. Mank was brought in to do the script by Orson. And so right away we have that contrast with this young up-and-comer, and we have a guy who's been in this business, and they're clashing. Although I thought that's the one thing about the movie I thought they'd do more of. They'd have them like kind of... Orson Welles was not really a character in this movie as much as I thought he would be. It's really more about Mank's relationship with William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst is who he based Charles Foster Kane on. And to see that whole drama play out was very interesting. And it's also a story about how Mank, as a Hollywood screenwriter, made movies. Like how he was making movies in general for other studios too. How RKO and other studios were declining and desperately needed options. It was after the Great Depression. People weren't going to the movies. It was a weird time for movies. Actually, and this movie ends up being very relevant for now and what the film industry is going through now. It's very similar. And if they can get out of it in the 40s and be back in theaters, I think we can get out of it today and be back in theaters too. The difference is they didn't have another option back then like TV and streaming. We have that now, so it's very different. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out. But it ends up being very relevant for today. Very reminiscent of what's going on. Um, and of course, the story was about how Citizen Kane was made and what its making did to Herman, what it did to him mentally. What I didn't expect was that the story would focus so much on how Mank navigated the filmmaking community of the 30s, the years prior to Citizen Kane. These years were the years of the fallout of the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism, and World War II. It's always intriguing to see Hollywood in its most interesting years of crisis. Someone will make a movie about this era and what we're going through with COVID, probably, and the film industry and how it was impacted. Sure. The real conflict is introduced at the halfway point. Mank being cut out by Orson, right? This attempt to maintain no screen credit for Mank because he agreed to it originally, but then now, of course, at this point in the film, he wants to be the person credited for this story about Hearst because it's about Hearst, and he wants to be the guy that he wants Hearst to know. Obviously, he wanted him to know. You know, it's not like they weren't gonna know. They had to have known on some level anyway. But Mank wanted it to be the guy, and not to mention, it gets so personal for him. It's such a journey for him making this movie, and he's convinced that he's done. Like he's washed up. It's just not good. He's convinced it's not good, and he's not good. And that's why my favorite scene in the movie too is when his brother Joe, who I said goes on to have quite a career himself, Joe says to him, "It's the greatest thing you've ever written," and it was, and it became, and it's still one of the greatest films ever made. But when people talk about Citizen Kane, they talk about why it was great on a technical level, on a visual level, right? Because of Orson and the directing and cinematography moves that he made. But nobody talks about the story being still so great. And it was. The story was just as great as anything else, I think. I love some of the dialogue. To try quote some of the dialogue. And I think it's just all around just as much of an impactful story. It was just as impactful storytelling wise as it was technically. You know, technical stuff. Gary Oldman is a presence on the screen, and we want to follow him wherever he's going, doing whatever he's doing. Amanda Seyfried was also quite good. The real talent, besides the Oscar-worthy performance of Oldman, was actually Lily Collins, I thought, who played Rita. Her dynamic with Oldman, right? She plays his nurse, right? She was a great character. Second best, in my opinion, to Mank. Other thing that stood out to me, I noticed that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross scored this movie. Not the thing that I thought I'd see them in next. After the things they've done, they did Gone Girl and Social Network. It's just their style is so not this, and they did fantastic. They captured the era and those types of movies with their score. So every element in this movie makes it feel like an old movie. Even the score. I also find it interesting that screenwriters have the most interesting life stories, it seems. Between Mank and Trumbo, it's worth noting that writers are, of course, where the inception of a film comes from. These minds are full of mystery and creativity. Don't ever underestimate them or underappreciate them. Don't underappreciate writers. It starts with writers, and it seems writers have more interesting stories to tell than directors. How many movies are there about directors? Like, there's a couple, right? There's a few. But screenwriting stories are always interesting because they focus on the writing, man, and something that gets brushed over a lot. I feel like not as much, which thank God. There's a whole thing going on right now, relevance-wise. This movie coming out now is great. My overall rating of it is 8.3 out of 10. It's good, not great, but even as I'm sitting here talking about it, I might up that. It might be great. It might be great. But for now, that's probably where I'll keep it. Because it's not like it blew me away every moment of it. It's not some. It wasn't great. It was good though. It was really good, and it's something that if you're a big movie person, for starters, definitely you need to watch it. But even if you're not, check it out because it is an interesting story about film history. It's just an historical moment in the cinema. definitely be watching it again. It'll age well, probably. Overall, it almost had like this. It was almost like this noir feel to it sometimes, like a delusional, a disillusioned and darkly comedic perspective. Mank's perspective that I found myself often appreciating. Um, all the little stylistic choices, especially the music, really caught me. But overall, there's a lot about this film I still have to think about, which is why, in time, I will be watching it again. But for now, that is my assessment of it.